Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. What you're about to hear is part 18 in a series on the decline and fall of the Soviet Union. I believe each of these episodes will stand on its own, but if you're the sort of person who likes to have the full context of a story, those earlier episodes are available for you to go and listen to in the same place you found this one. Last week, I gave a brief overview of the history of Cuba and the early life and career of Fidel Castro. This week, I will pick up where I left off last week, with Castro and a small band of ragtag rebels staggering into the remote Sierra Maestra to wage a guerrilla campaign against the US-backed dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, with little hope of success. This week, I will conclude my telling of the Cuban Revolution. I do feel the need to tell you up front that this is the quote-unquote Cliff Notes version of the Cuban Revolution. The story of the Cuban Revolution is a rich tapestry of complex and fascinating characters and events that goes far beyond the chronology of the career of Fidel Castro. Of all the events I've studied, it is one of the most interesting and improbable. I would love to tell you the whole tale and give a detailed background on all the important characters, and perhaps one day I will come back and revisit the Cuban Revolution in this podcast. But for now, I have made an executive decision not to get overly sidetracked from the main story of the Soviet Union. If you don't want to wait for me to come back and revisit this subject to get the full story, I highly recommend Cuba Libre, Che, Fidel, and the Improbable Revolution That Changed World History by Tony Perrottet. It's one of my sources for this week's episode and a great place to start your journey into the history of the Cuban Revolution. Now, without further ado, I bring you the conclusion of my telling of the Cuban Revolution. This is The End of History, Part 18. Back in 2007, when Barack Obama was still a relatively unknown politician seeking the Democratic nomination for president, I saw one of the first viral YouTube videos I remember seeing. It was a music video of an attractive, scantily clad young woman singing a catchy pop song about her crush on Obama. It was a silly little video, but it was viewed millions of times, and I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that it helped spread awareness of Obama's campaign and had a real impact on the 2008 Democratic primary election. The Obama campaign denied having anything to do with the video, and the man himself went so far as to complain that the video upset his daughters. But Obama's campaign was unprecedented among mainstream candidates in its prolific use of social media for campaigning, something that in 2024 goes without saying. But in 2008, social media was still relatively young and used almost exclusively by young people. The strategy was not an obvious one, but it paid off. The youth vote was decisive in Obama winning the presidency in 2008. Some members of the other major American political party, the Republicans, reacted by dubbing Obama as a quote-unquote celebrity president. The supreme irony was lost on many that 8 years later, these same Republicans would nominate the star of a reality TV show, Celebrity Apprentice, Donald Trump. This seeming immunity to irony spread to the Democrats when Trump won the presidency in 2016, and many Democrats who had feigned offense when Barack Obama was called a celebrity president now regularly derided Trump as the quote-unquote celebrity president. The truth, in my opinion at least, is that both men were to some extent celebrities. And Ronald Reagan, and Franklin Roosevelt, and every other modern president for that matter. All of these American presidents successfully used the media of their day to build their public image, and used that image to propel political success. Just as Obama and Trump used social media, Reagan used television, and Roosevelt the radio. This is neither new, nor is it unique to America. If you've ever studied Latin, you probably have at least read parts of Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars. Propaganda dispatches meant to build Caesar's renown and popularity, his celebrity, among the Roman people. As an American, coming from the culture and the system that I come from, I always saw Fidel Castro's military fatigues and long beard to be off-putting, symbols of a tin pot dictator who fancies himself a generalissimo. but I was viewing him out of context. Castro's olive green fatigues and beard were part of his carefully crafted public image as a rugged, revolutionary guerrilla soldier, a down-to-earth man of the people. Successful manipulation of the media of their time is one of the key reasons that Castro and his 26th of July movement succeeded, where so many similar movements have failed when faced with similarly overwhelming odds. And the odds were overwhelmingly against them. When we left off last week, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and a ragtag band of guerrillas were defeated and nearly wiped out shortly after landing in Cuba, returning from their exile in Mexico. Following a devastating ambush by the Cuban army, of the original 82 men who landed on the Granma, only about 20 managed to limp away into the relative safety of the Sierra Maestra on the southeastern tip of the island. They had been so badly mauled in the ambush that they didn't even have enough rifles for all of them, and many of the weapons they did have were in poor condition. They were tired, hungry, thirsty, and with the exception of Fidel and Che, thoroughly demoralized. Their enemies, the Cuban army, under the regime of dictator Fulgencio Batista, numbered in the tens of thousands, and were well fed and equipped, and enjoyed the full backing of the U.S. government. In January 1957, as Castro and his men settled into their first mountain camp, a betting man wouldn't have given them much of a chance. Even after they won their first victory, a minor one, at La Plata, where they defeated a small army garrison and executed the local land overseer, gaining them the loyalty of the local poor peasants whom the overseer had abused and oppressed for years. Following the ambush, Batista had gleefully announced to the nation that Fidel Castro was dead. Castro's first task, therefore, was getting the word out that he was alive, a task easier said than done, as Batista's dictatorship had a tight grip on the Cuban press. So Castro put the word out to some of his movement's members in the city to arrange an interview with an American journalist, and they succeeded spectacularly. One of the other hidden advantages the rebels had, in addition to their media savvy, that I will talk about shortly, was their organization. The clandestine network of operatives and supporters throughout the country meant that even at their lowest point, the 26th of July movement was never just a band of guerrillas in the mountains. And in this case, Castro's network made contact with the New York Times correspondent on the island, Ruby Hart Phillips, who immediately jumped at the opportunity to land the Times an interview with Castro. She knew that if she did the interview herself, her visa would be revoked and she would be kicked out of the country. So she arranged for the interview to be conducted by the Times veteran war reporter who had covered the Spanish Civil War, Herbert Matthews. The rebels, who knew Matthews from his coverage of the Spanish Civil War and understood him to harbor leftist sympathies, could think of no one better, and readily agreed to the interview. Before Matthews was smuggled into their camp, Castro planned an elaborate deception to convince the reporter that his army, which had grown from about 20 to around 30 men, actually numbered in the hundreds and was capable of winning the war. He ordered his comrades to interrupt him with news from the other columns, and for his men to march around in circles to give the impression that there were more of them. What's shocking is not that Fidel attempted this deception, but that it seems to have worked on Matthews, who was a seasoned combat reporter. When the article was published on the front page of the New York Times on February 24, 1957, it painted Castro and his movement with a glowing and optimistic brush. It opened with, quote, "Fidel Castro, the rebel leader of Cuba's youth, is alive and fighting hard and successfully in the rugged, almost impenetrable vastness of the Sierra Maestra at the southern tip of the island. President Fulgencio Batista has the cream of his army around the area, but the army men are fighting a thus far losing battle to destroy the most dangerous enemy General Batista has faced in a long and adventurous career as a Cuban leader and dictator." End quote. This was all, at this point, pure fiction. The rebels had won one small victory, and as yet posed no significant threat to the regime. But with Matthews' help, they would capture the imaginations of the Cuban and American people. Matthews went on to describe the movement in similarly positive terms, stating of its goals, quote, "It is a revolutionary movement that calls itself socialistic. It is also nationalistic, which generally in Latin America means anti-Yankee. The program is vague and couched in generalities, but it amounts to a new deal for Cuba: radical, democratic, and therefore anti-communist. End quote. When the Times reached out to the Cuban government for a statement, a spokesman for Batista said that the story was fiction and that Fidel was dead. To apply the language of today, they called it fake news. When the article was published, along with this statement, the regime had egg on its face, as the article contained a photo of Fidel with his signature reading Fidel Castro, Sierra Maestra, February 17, 1957. Though the regime did everything in their power to suppress the article, it found its way into the homes of the Cuban intelligentsia, many of whom were supporters of the 26th of July movement. They reproduced it and spread it all over the island. It captured the imaginations not just of Cubans, but Americans as well. Among the rush of new recruits to Castro's growing band of guerrillas were 3 American teenagers, the sons of U.S. Navy personnel stationed at Guantanamo Bay who ran away to join the revolution. When in May, a CBS Evening News camera crew smuggled their equipment into the Sierra Maestra for Fidel's first television interview, the 3 young gringos were prominently featured in the camera footage, archetypes of the all-American boy, complete with rifles and red and black 26th of July movement armbands. Castro and most of the other guerrillas were fond of the boys, with the notable exception of Che Guevara, who referred to them as tourists and believed they did not belong in the mountains among the revolutionaries. He probably secretly feared that boys like these might one day commercialize him and plaster his face on a t-shirt for commercial benefit, and he clearly wanted no part in that. The boys were not the only American gringos to volunteer with the Cuban rebels. In total, about 25 Americans would fight with the 26th of July movement. There undoubtedly would have been more, but the rebels were selective about taking foreigners into their ranks. The teenagers were accepted because of their propaganda value, but only the oldest, Chuck Ryan, who was over 18, would ever do any real fighting with the movement. The other 2 were sent home relatively quickly, lest they get themselves killed and harm the movement's public image in the U.S. The other Americans who were allowed to join the guerrillas generally had, or at least claimed to have, significant military and combat experience, which was sorely lacking among the droves of fresh recruits streaming to join the movement in the wake of the positive media coverage. Most new recruits were from the impoverished peasant population of rural eastern Cuba, where Castro's support was strongest, though some also came from the cities. Many of the recruits from the cities had difficulty adjusting to life in the mountains, and desertion was a constant problem. This growing army in the mountains was supplied and supported by an extensive underground network of supporters in every corner of Cuba, as well as in the Cuban diaspora communities abroad. The linchpin of this organization was a young woman named Celia Sanchez. Sanchez maintained her cover for as long as she could, organizing the logistics of the revolution while maintaining a publicly respectable face as the daughter of a prominent physician. Eventually, her cover would be blown, and she would flee the police, joining Fidel in the mountains, where she would become both his lover and one of his closest confidants. Though their romance waned in the years after the revolution, Sanchez would remain by Castro's side as his closest advisor until her death from lung cancer in January 1980. Celia Sanchez was far from the only woman to join the revolutionaries. By mid-1958, between 10 and 15% of the rebel army was made up of women. Like the young gringos, Castro ensured that the young women were placed front and center in prominent roles within the movement, where they would be captured on camera. Their images would grace news clippings and magazine covers the world over, capturing the essence of feminism and women's liberation, and helping to spread those ideas around the globe. The other remarkable thing about the rebels, male and female, was their extreme youth. Most of the rank-and-file guerrillas were in their late teens and early 20s. Castro, 31 years old in 1957, and Che, who was 29, were among the oldest in the bunch. At 37, Celia Sanchez was relatively ancient. The rebels eventually grew to match in reality the hundreds of soldiers and multiple columns that they had pretended to have in February 1957. By the summer of 1958, they were operating with impunity throughout the Sierra Maestra. They soon set up a micro-republic in the region, where they enjoyed overwhelming support from the population. They collected taxes from the locals to fund their army, and even funded new schools and medical clinics in villages throughout the mountains, even further ingratiating the population to them. They operated a pirate radio station, Radio Rebelde, from which they broadcast their victories all over Cuba, and referred to their micro-republic in the mountains as, quote, the first free territory of the Americas, end quote. By that summer, it was clear that the rebels were no longer just a nuisance to be ignored by Batista, so he resolved to finish them once and for all, assembling a strike force of over 10,000 soldiers. Their equipment included Sherman tanks as well as several state-of-the-art bomber aircraft, supplied to them by the United States. The rebels at this point numbered somewhere between 300 and 400. Once again, it looked like the rebels did not stand a chance, but appearances can be deceiving. Of the soldiers sent into the mountains by Batista, roughly half were raw recruits with very little training, and even among the more experienced soldiers, few had much in the way of any combat experience. The rebels, by contrast, had been fighting a constant hit-and-run campaign in the mountains for a year and a half at this point, and most of them were hardened combat veterans. The rebels also fought with the power of belief. They were young, full of idealism, and prepared to lay down their lives for their ideals. Whereas many of Batista's soldiers were conscripts, and even those who joined the army by choice often did so to escape poverty rather than for more patriotic reasons, and few of the rank-and-file soldiers had any love for the dictator. They certainly did not want to die for him. The rebels had a clear edge when it came to morale, which, in my opinion, was the most decisive factor in the battles to come. Rather than engaging the army in open battle, which they understood would be suicide, the rebels split into multiple smaller units. They would hit the army at vulnerable points and then melt away into the mountains, forcing the army to split up and pursue. The rebel columns split off in different directions, forcing Batista's army to split up and pursue them, deeper and deeper into the wilderness. In that wilderness, the rebels not only knew the ground, but they had the support of the locals, who did nothing to help the army, but always reported on the army's movements to the rebels. In this way, throughout the summer and fall, despite overwhelming odds, the rebels stacked small victory on top of small victory, melting away into the wilderness before the army could ever concentrate their superior resources to overwhelm them. Eventually, the morale of the army, which was never very high to begin with, completely collapsed, and the army was forced into a humiliating retreat from the Sierra Maestra. Following this victory, many expected Castro and the rebels to regroup and re-establish themselves in the Sierra Maestra, but smelling blood in the water, Castro sensed that now was finally the time to be aggressive. He sent his army on the offensive, dividing it into 4 columns. The first and second columns would remain in southeastern Cuba, under the command of Fidel and his brother Raul. Their goal was to keep the bulk of the Cuban army tied down in the east, while 2 more columns slipped away and struck targets further west. The third and fourth columns would strike west, under the command of Che Guevara and another hero of the revolution, little known outside of Cuba but revered within it, Camilo Cienfuegos. Their very ambitious goal was to capture and hold the city of Santa Clara in central Cuba, which would effectively cut the country in two, leaving the entire eastern half of the island in rebel control. By this time, the rebels had garnered a reputation for fierceness and near invincibility. Though the army outnumbered and outgunned them more than ever before, the morale of the soldiers was collapsing. The word was also out that in contrast to how rebel prisoners were treated by the army, as a general rule they were tortured and then executed, the soldiers captured by the rebels were treated as errant brothers with kindness and magnanimity. Hundreds of soldiers simply crossed the line and surrendered to the rebels, rather than risk dying for a failing dictatorship. Some of the soldiers even switched sides, donning 26th of July movement armbands and turning their guns on their erstwhile comrades. None of this is to say that the rebels earned easy victories. December 1958 was marked by brutal fighting across the island, especially in and around Santa Clara, as Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos led their columns into the besieged city. Yet despite pockets of fierce resistance, and the army enjoying clear numerical and technical supremacy, it was clear that the rebels were winning. Batista still had plenty of money, weapons, and support from the United States. Although the US had repudiated him publicly due to the brutality of his regime, the CIA still continued to funnel almost unlimited money and supplies to him clandestinely. He probably could have stayed and continued the fight. The rebels still controlled only a fraction of the country, and none of its major cities. But like the soldiers fighting for him, Batista just seems to have lost hope and given up. On New Year's Eve 1958, he packed his family, his closest supporters, and as much wealth as they could carry, and fled the country. As Batista and his retinue boarded the plane that would take them into exile, the very soldiers who were supposed to be providing his security taunted him with chants of Viva Fidel. The war, it seemed, was over. Cuba awoke on New Year's Day, 1959, to the news that Batista had fled. The workers of Havana launched a general strike, crippling the shell of a government that remained behind in Batista's absence. Across the country, with nobody left to give them orders, entire divisions of the Cuban army either surrendered to the rebels or simply dropped their weapons and went home. Fidel and Raul Castro, who had been steeling themselves for a long and bloody siege of Santiago, Cuba's second city, simply marched in without a fight and were greeted by throngs of cheering supporters. The following day, on January 2nd, 1959, Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos rolled into Havana to a similar reception. Fidel Castro then led a victorious march all the way across the country, from Santiago to Havana, stopping to greet his adoring fans and give speeches along the way. He arrived in Havana on January 9th. He and his 26th of July movement were the unquestioned masters of Cuba. But who were these unwashed, bearded rebels who now controlled the fate of millions? What did they want? As Herbert Matthews had stated in his very first article on Fidel in 1957, their program was vague and full of generalities. They often used words like democracy without ever really defining what that meant to them. In truth, they were winging it. They had not really expected victory to come so quickly, and they never expected to find themselves with such uncontested control over the country, but rather expected victory would come with some kind of power-sharing agreement with other opposition factions. Even among the rebels, there were few communists, though two of the movement's prominent leaders, Raul Castro and Che Guevara, did proclaim themselves to be Marxists. Fidel Castro had been careful over the years to distance himself from communism, afraid that to align too closely with it would alienate wealthy and middle-class Cubans whose support he needed to overthrow Batista. Even the various intelligence profiles of him conducted by the CIA concluded that he was not a communist, but rather, one report from 1958 described him as, quote, a left-of-center nationalist determined to achieve economic independence for Cuba from the United States, end quote. He had readily accepted clandestine support from the Soviet Union during the years of rebellion, but this, the CIA concluded, was a relationship of convenience, rather than evidence of any real affinity on Castro's part for the USSR. Indeed, the United States was the first foreign country to recognize Castro's government in Cuba, and many in the US government believed that in victory, Castro would moderate himself and become somebody they could work with. A year earlier, he had proclaimed alongside other leaders from his movement that following a brief provisional government to enact necessary land reform, Cuba would have democratic elections, and nobody yet had any reason to doubt this promise. So began a sort of honeymoon period. In April, Fidel accepted an invitation from the American Society of Newspaper Editors to give a speech in Washington, D.C., and it kicked off a sort of surreal publicity tour of the eastern United States. He appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show and CBS Face the Nation, he toured the Lincoln Memorial, and went on an excursion to Mount Vernon, and he was met with cheering crowds of admirers when he visited New York City. President Eisenhower ensured that he was too busy to meet with Castro, sending his vice president, Richard Nixon, to meet with him instead. Castro was angered by the snub, and he immediately disliked Nixon. It seems the feeling was mutual. Nixon came away from the meeting suspicious, but not convinced of Castro's communist leanings. He stated of his impression that Castro was, quote, either incredibly naive about communism or under communist discipline. My guess is the former, End quote. Despite his obvious personal dislike for the man, Nixon did come away from the meeting with the determination that Castro could be reasoned with, and that diplomatic engagement with his government was a worthwhile endeavor. Eisenhower would ultimately go a different direction. Even before his trip to the United States, Castro's government had already begun its slide into authoritarianism. Che Guevara had come away from his experience of surviving a CIA-backed coup in Guatemala convinced that the coup had succeeded because the leftist government there had failed to purge its enemies, allowing counter-revolution to infiltrate and take root. He was determined not to make the same mistake in Cuba, and his friend Fidel agreed. Batista's remaining henchmen, as well as many innocent former government officials who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, were rounded up for quote-unquote revolutionary justice, which amounted to Stalin-esque show trials. The accused had no right to cross-examine witnesses against them, call their own witnesses, or even, sometimes, to speak in their own defense. When confronted with the unfairness of the trials, Castro, who you will recall was a lawyer, responded sharply, quote, "Revolutionary justice is not based on legal precepts, but moral conviction. We are not executing innocent people or political opponents. We are executing murderers, and they deserve it." End quote. The revolution would soon also turn on its own. On October 20th, 1959, Huber Matos, a tried and true member of the 26th of July movement, who had landed with Fidel on the Granma and fought with him all through the rebellion, was arrested for expressing doubts about the authoritarian, communist direction of the revolutionary government in a private letter to Fidel, who he considered a friend. He was the first of many children of the revolution who would be devoured by it. The promised elections also never materialized. In time, Castro would come to hold mass rallies in front of his most ardent supporters and ask them, the people, to approve or disapprove of his proposed policies. This, he contended, was more democratic than quote-unquote bourgeois elections, despite no opposition ever being voiced. The honeymoon with the United States would promptly end in May 1959, when Castro returned to Cuba and instituted the first of a series of land reform laws, which stripped land from massive American-owned sugar plantations and gave it to the poor, landless laborers who had previously worked on those plantations. The U.S. Congress responded by halting imports of sugar from Cuba, to which Castro responded by nationalizing more and more American-owned businesses on the island. He also appointed a communist, Che, to run Cuba's national bank and plan the economy. Though he did not yet declare himself a Marxist, he began working more closely with the Soviet-backed Cuban communists and became diplomatically closer to the Soviet Union. Castro visited New York again in September 1960 to attend a meeting of the UN General Assembly and received a much colder reception than he did on his first visit. He ultimately decided to stay in Harlem and meet with radical civil rights leaders, including Malcolm X, showcasing not for the first or the last time his, I think, genuine dedication to radical racial equality. But this action did not win him friends in the US government, who suspected X and many of the other leaders of the more radical wing of the civil rights movement of having ties to the Soviets. Nikita Khrushchev, who was also in New York for the meeting of the General Assembly, made a pilgrimage uptown to Harlem and met with Castro for the first time. The two famously warmly embraced one another in front of the cameras. And when it came time for the other to speak at the UN, each was the first and loudest to cheer for the other. Castro and Khrushchev were making a very public statement for the world to see that they were friends and allies. There was no longer any doubt that Cuba was moving inexorably into the enemy camp of the Cold War. To Eisenhower, this was unacceptable, as Cuba laid a mere 90 miles from the coastline of the United States. Even before Castro's trip to the UN, Eisenhower had authorized the CIA to build a plan for overthrowing and replacing Castro's government by force. Now, with his worst fears confirmed, he authorized the CIA to put that plan into action. The plan was, in a nutshell, for an army of anti-Castro Cuban emigres, armed, trained, and equipped by the CIA, to land in Cuba and, with American logistical support, defeat Castro's revolutionary forces, overthrow his government, and restore a U.S.-aligned government to the island. Eisenhower left office after his second term, and in November 1960, a Democrat, John F. Kennedy, defeated his Vice President Richard Nixon in the presidential election. Kennedy, however, agreed with the Eisenhower administration's approach to Cuba, and upon being briefed on the invasion plan when he took office on January 20th, 1961, he approved its execution. On April 17th, 1961, this invasion force was landed on Cuba by American landing craft, launched from American ships, and supported in the air by American aircraft. It was immediately obvious to everybody who was behind the invasion, but the United States military avoided direct involvement so as to maintain plausible deniability. Basically nothing went right for the invading force, which was quickly defeated by the forces of the Castro regime. But it left Castro fearing that, with their proxies having failed, the US military would directly intervene in Cuba and overthrow him. This was a conflict he was not sure he could win, and was therefore uneager to have. So, in desperation, he turned to his newest ally, the Soviet Union, and asked them for direct military support to deter an American invasion. Nikita Khrushchev was more than happy to provide him with that deterrent. That's everything for today. Thank you so much for listening. As always, a special thanks to those of you who are supporting the show on Spotify and Patreon with monthly donations. If you're not a supporter yet and you want to be, you can support the show with a monthly donation on Patreon or through Spotify. Links to both can be found on the show's website at www.thehistorysphere.com. You can also support us by subscribing and giving us a 5-star rating on whichever podcast platform you're listening on, and by following and engaging with us on social media. I'm most active on Instagram and TikTok, but I have a presence on other social media platforms as well. Links to all of my social media can be found on the website. Finally, the most common way people learn about new podcasts is by word of mouth, so you can also support the show by telling your friends how much you're enjoying it and pointing them my way. I will be taking a break from my regular scheduled programming and the End of History series for the next 2 weeks, because I will be on vacation with my family. But I will be releasing a special standalone episode related to the history of my travel destination next week, and I hope you will tune in for that. I will also update my social media with some special history-related content while I'm away, so if you haven't followed us yet, make sure you do that so you don't miss anything. When I return to the End of History series after my vacation, I will finally cover the long-awaited Cuban Missile Crisis and its consequences. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful day.